The Green Futures of Tycho by William Sleator. 15. It was dusk. In the purple twilight, the yard was dim and full of green shadows. A heavy, rotten smell hung in the motionless air. The new addition sagged, full of large holes, soft around the edges like melted wax. Behind it loomed what was left of the house, half seen in the fading light. The roof was gone. Much of the exterior wall had crumbled away. Inside, broken glass and rubble filled the rooms. The furniture was blackened and ruined, the interior walls cracked and gaping. Little fires flickered delicately here and there. Exposed pipes gurgled and hissed. An old man, Bobby, lay on the pavement beside the addition. Tamara sat near him. When she saw Tycho appear, she shrugged and looked away. There was a footstep behind him. Someone grabbed his arms and pinioned them behind his back. Tycho's knees went weak with shock. He cried out. Tamara didn't even turn to look. Escape! He had to get away from here, but the person behind him had a grip like iron. One hand held Tycho's wrists together, bending his arms back painfully. Another hand was prying his fingers open, trying to get the egg away from him. No! Tycho screamed. The weakness left him. He struggled violently, twisting his body, kicking out with his feet. The person behind tightened his grip, grunting. He wrenched Tycho's arms back into an even more excruciating position. Tycho bellowed in pain and kicked back with all his strength. Then something grabbed him by the ankles, and he went over. The pain in his arms made him helpless. His grip weakened. The egg slipped out of his grasp. Instantly, his arms were dropped. For a moment, Tycho lay there limply on his stomach, gasping. As the pain ebbed, he was stunned by the suddenness of what had happened. But quickly, realization came flooding back. Someone had taken the egg. He staggered to his feet and came face to face with his older self. The man was bent over from the weight of the pack on his back, but he was smiling pleasantly. Little green growths were sprouting out of the stain on his face. He held the egg he had taken from Tycho in his hand. No! Give it back! Tycho screamed and grabbed for it, but his older self stepped quickly away. He held the egg up out of Tycho's reach and gazed at it. Yes, he murmured, I remember this stage. Just beginning to get nice. But you can't do this! Tycho cried and jumped for it. But his older self was too fast for him. He reached behind and dropped it into his pack. The pack sealed itself shut. Tycho grabbed the pack. A terrible feeling, more painful than an electric shock, seared his hands and raced through his body. He collapsed onto the ground. His older self stood over him, looking down. His grotesque face was blank now, empty, almost simple-minded. He scratched his head vaguely. But why? Tycho said, half sobbing, feeling tears welling out of his eyes. Why do you want me here? Why can't I just take it and go away? The ugly man shook his head. Oh no, I can't let you do that. It wouldn't be safe. Safe? Tycho moaned. But all I want to do is go away from here. What could I do to harm you? The man's face hardened. You could change things. You could go back and make it different. After I've worked so hard, you could ruin everything. Ruin everything? Tycho repeated, totally bewildered. He pushed himself to his feet and gestured at the house. But look around you. Everything already is ruined. How could I do anything worse than this? Oh, no, you don't understand. His older self smiled faintly and shook his head, as if he were talking to a very stupid child. This is what they want. This is what they like. This is what they told me to do. It's almost ready now. His smile widened. Soon they'll be here, very soon. And I did it all. I opened the way for them. I did what they told me. But... Hopeless, Tycho stared into his future face. How could he argue with him? There was no reason there. All that was left of him was a kind of dog-like loyalty and devotion. To what? To the thing he carried on his back? To the messages he heard from it? He and not his family was the real slave. There was no point in trying to change his mind. He couldn't undo the influence of 20 years, but perhaps he still had a chance to escape. It was the word slave that made him remember the last future and gave him an idea. Tamara had been making duplicates of the egg. Perhaps she had done that in this future too, and then he could get one from her and get out of here. He left himself staring hopefully up at the darkening sky and hurried over to where she sat. She had Bobby's bald, wrinkled head in her lap and was stroking it softly. Tamara, he said, look at me. Do you know who I am? She looked at him briefly without interest. Go away, little boy, she said wearily. But Tamara, don't you recognize me? I'm Tycho. 11-year-old Tycho. You have to help me. Don't be ridiculous, she said. He never looked like that. Tamara, just listen, he pleaded. I really am Tycho. I came from the past with a thing like he has to travel through time. And he took it away from me and I'm stuck here, but I saw you making duplicates of it once. If you gave me one and I got away, I could change things and save us, and this would never happen. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. I don't know what it is you want from me, and I can't help you. Just leave me alone. Tamara, please, you have to believe me. If you don't go away now, I'll get that man over there to take you away, she said angrily. He's strong. I'll tell him to hurt you. Tycho turned and glanced at his older self and saw him vanish. Obviously, he had just departed on some detestable errand in time. Tycho turned back to Tamara. All right? You don't have to believe me, but what about Ludwig and Leonardo? Where are they? Who are they? She said. I never heard of them. You never... But they're your brothers, he cried, spreading his arms. You must know them. I only have one brother, she said harshly, and now I'm going to tell him to come over here and... Then her voice faded, and with it faded her dress and her hands and her face. A dim, smoky filter passed across the world. Tamara was not there. She had never been there. Tamara! He moaned, backing away. Tamara, don't! There is no Tamara, croaked the old man lying on the ground. And in that moment of horror, the answer all at once slid into place. The common element that linked all the futures he had seen was revealed to him. It was the egg. Of course, it was obvious, so obvious that he had not realized it until now, until it was too late. Any future it took him to would have to include it. In every future, he had it with him. He used it. He depended on it. And it was more than just a time travel device. He didn't know what its other functions were, or what his older self was trying to do to the world, or what he meant by they. He didn't even know whether it was really evil or just too subtle and sophisticated a tool for a human being to handle. What he did know was that it had done terrible things to him. It was at the root of all the miserable futures he had seen, and there was only one way to prevent those futures from coming true. It was maddeningly simple. He had merely to go back and change things so that he would never find it. But how? He would never be able to get away from his older self now. He was trapped here in this hideous, stinking world he had created, and it was all his fault for being so stupid. If he had thought of it only 15 minutes ago, it would have made all the difference. He could have gotten rid of it and cleansed himself in the future of its influence. Now it was too late. Something pressed against his arm. He spun around. It was his older self, returned from his errand, standing beside him. The man looked down at Bobby, lying on the ground and breathing shallowly. He prodded Bobby with his big foot, as though he were a piece of trash. They don't like him, he murmured, and then he turned from Bobby, and his eyes met Tycho's. One of them was half closed by a new green thing sprouting just above it. They don't like you either, he said softly. Tycho took a step backwards. What happened to Tamara? He said. Tamara? Who's that? Said his older self, his mouth twitching as though he were trying not to laugh. You know who I mean, Tycho shouted. You can't pretend to me. She was our sister, and you just went back and did something to get rid of her. What did you do? Fix it so she was never born? Oh, no. That's much too complicated, the man said complacently. She died when she was 2. She drowned in the bathtub. Tycho felt numbness growing in his stomach. He moved farther away from the creature that he had become. You mean you went back and killed her when she was 2? It had to happen, the man said, sounding quite reasonable. If she had lived, she would have been in the way. He moved close to Tycho again. The smell of him was vile. In the way, like you are now. But you can't do anything to me, Tycho said, shaking his head. I mean, I'm you, a younger version of you. We're the same person, he gestured with his hands, trying to get through to him. If you get rid of me, then you'll be getting rid of yourself, don't you see? If I don't exist, then you won't exist either. If you kill me, you'll never grow up. You just can't do it. But there are other things I can do, murmured his older self. Tycho turned and ran for the house. In another flash, one last idea had come to him, one final shred of hope. The time Ludwig had found the egg in his room, and he had made a quick trip back to change things so that Ludwig would not find it. In doing so, he had generated a duplicate of the egg. He had kicked it into the closet out of Ludwig's view. He had left it there. His older self, after a moment of indecision, took off after him. Tycho jumped through one of the holes in the addition. Inside, the floor was soft, sticky, slowing him down. He squelched through it, trying not to breathe the horrible smell, up the ramp to the kitchen. Was it possible that the egg was still there in the back of his closet after 20 years? That Judy had not swept it away? That Ludwig had not found it again? That he himself had forgotten it and not hidden it somewhere else? The chance was small, appallingly small, but it was his only chance. The liquid filth on the kitchen floor was several inches deep. More brackish stuff gurgled out of the overflowing sink. Tycho splashed through it and started up the stairs. He could hear his older self grunting only a few yards behind. His legs were longer. If it were not for the weight of the pack on his back, he would have overtaken him already. At the top of the flight, there were 3 missing steps. Tycho took a deep breath and leapt over the gap. He landed, and his right foot went through a hole in the floor. He ripped it out, twisting his ankle painfully. The going was treacherous here, piles of rubble hiding the missing floorboards. It was also too dark to see anything very clearly, but he plunged ahead recklessly, hoping not to fall again. He kicked aside an old doll of Tamara's, a ballerina doll, blackened and headless now, and limped into his room, and cried out in pain as his hopes vanished. The room was empty. The bed, the desk, all the furniture was gone. There was only a bare floor buried under broken glass and wet plaster and ashes. Someone must have found the thing when the room had been emptied, but he couldn't give up, not while he could still think and move. He raced to the closet, sank to his knees, and began sifting frantically through the debris. In a moment, his hands were bleeding, but he didn't notice. He tossed aside a melted telephone and a charred edition of Yeats, a transistor radio, and a postcard from Hawaii. Behind him, heavy footsteps crunched through the trash. There was a gulping snort, and 2 large, damp hands closed around his neck. "No, you can't! You'll be killing yourself!" Tycho gasped, barely able to get the words out through the sudden pressure on his throat. And then, against all reason, his own hands closed around something familiar in the dust. His older self let go of his neck, kicked him brutally in the side of the head, and reached for the egg. But Tycho had already spun the dials without even looking, backward into the past, anywhere. He pressed down on the jewel. "Where did you come from?" someone bellowed, and the bedside light went on. Tycho lifted his head weakly to see who it was. There were 2 people in the bed. "Oh, sorry," Tycho said, not even able to be embarrassed. "I didn't mean to..." Then his older self flashed into the room. The controls were clenched in his hand, and his eyes were fixed on the exact spot where Tycho lay. But that was impossible. How could his older self have found the precise moment that Tycho had so randomly escaped to? It must be just a ghastly coincidence. Tycho spun the dials and jumped again. Sunlight streamed into the room. Ludwig, in his 20s, sat at the desk talking to Leonardo, who stood in the doorway. "Must be a diary," Ludwig was saying. "Wait until you hear what he says about..." They both yelled as Tycho's older self appeared and started toward him. But it was impossible. How could he keep finding him this way? Tycho twisted the dials forward. Tycho twisted the dials farther than before and pressed down. "With this power, I can tell the future," he could hear himself saying. "Cut it out, Tycho," said Leonardo. Then Leonardo saw young Tycho appear and went pale. Tycho stumbled to his feet and pushed his way out of the room. He had to get outside so he wouldn't keep bumping into people and would have time to figure out what was happening. Behind him, his older self tramped noisily down the stairs. It wasn't coincidence. The egg had grown over the years, become more complex and more versatile. The tool his older self had could do many different things. It must have some kind of homing device in it that could trace the energy released when Tycho used the egg that he had and follow it anywhere. With a horrible sinking feeling, Tycho realized that he had not yet even begun to escape. He would only be safe when he had got rid of the egg for good. He raced out to the maple tree and leaned against it, panting. There was only one way to escape from his older self, one way to eliminate those terrible futures. He had to go back to before he found the egg and take it away. Then he would never find it. It would never poison his life and his future. None of this would ever happen. His older self was hurtling toward him across the lawn. He had to, this instant. He had to go this instant, but how far? He didn't know the date or the time where he was now. He was too frantic to calculate. What was he going to do? Then he noticed the freshly dug vegetable garden. That was it. It was really very simple. All he had to do was go back before he started the garden, dig up the egg, and throw it away. Then he would never find it. And that had been less than a week before that talk with Leonardo. He spun the dials back a week and jumped. Then he was down on his knees, clawing at the earth. Where was the exact spot? How deep it had been? Why wasn't it there? He had to hurry before his older self showed up. Then the earth dropped from his hands as another thought smote him. He sat up. Once he did find it, what was he going to do with it? Throw it into the next yard or across the street? Flush it down the toilet? What good would that do? All that would happen was that someone else would find it. Perhaps Tycho and his family would be safe for a while, but another person would still be influenced by it. And what would stop him from doing dangerous things to the world? No, you can't do that, his older self screamed harshly. Tycho was too late to escape another agonizing kick in the head, but he did have an instant to flip the dials back a few more years and press down on the jewel. He pushed himself to his feet and staggered a few paces across the lawn, just to be out of reach of his older self when he appeared. He didn't pay attention to the 3 children who were taunting another little boy. His head hurt so much now that he could barely think, and he didn't have much time. Where had the egg come from originally? It hadn't just burst into existence out of nothing. Someone or something must have put it there. It was odd that he had never wondered about it before. Now the question of its origin suddenly assumed gigantic importance. The only way to save the world from it was to go back and return it to whatever had brought it in the first place. No, thank you, we don't want it, he heard himself saying idiotically. His older self, hulking and demented, surged furiously toward him. Tycho held the egg up to his ear and spun the second most powerful dial, the one for centuries. He had never used it before. He pressed down on the jewel and felt faint. He was standing on a vast, featureless plain. It was dawn. Tall grasses bowed against the wind in all directions. A group of large, dark animals grazed several hundred yards to his left. But when had the egg made its first appearance on the earth? In order to give it back, he had to pinpoint the exact moment of its arrival. With all the eons at his disposal, there was no hope that he would stumble accidentally upon that moment. He felt himself go weak under another onslaught of hopelessness. It was impossible to get rid of it unless... His older self barreled toward him, hands outstretched. What? When? What are you doing? Tycho spun the dial and pressed. He was up to his waist in warm water. The slimy ooze under his feet was like quicksand, sucking him inexorably down. He couldn't stay here very long, but he needed a moment to think. What if it was impossible for the egg to take him back before its arrival on the earth? There was a certain logic to that. If there was any hint of how far back it could go, then its own existence in this space would have to be that limit, wouldn't it? The mud was up to his knees now, and the water lapped greasily around his neck. Something moved against his stomach. It had to be the answer. In order to reach the moment it had come here, he would make it take him as far back as it could go. It was the only hope of getting rid of it. All he had to do was... Then he was choking as the muddy water flowed into his lungs. His older self must be sitting on him, holding him under the water with his whole body, because there were 2 powerful hands grappling with him for the egg. Tycho fought the instinct to breathe. He kicked, he thrashed, and he felt for the inner dial, the most powerful dial turning, the dial for millennia. There was water in his lungs, but he couldn't spit it out because he would only breathe in more water. He felt like he was going to explode. He kept on spinning, the middle dial back, farther back, the enormity of the time span underneath his fingers was more frightening than anything else. Was it ever going to stop? Then it was being torn out of his hand, but the dial clicked into position and would not move. Tycho pressed down on the jewel and felt very faint indeed. And that is the end of chapter 15.